Welcome to the second lecture, Technology and Information Technology Viewpoints. Now here I'm going to start with a little bit of a review of what we talked about technology and society before. So you'll see a few slides you've seen before, but I just want to reintroduce that topic as we step into a little bit of like, well, what's the difference between technology and information technology, and what are some viewpoints that are out there about technology, and then the counters to those viewpoints to see a possible different side. So, as I discussed like last lecture, technology doesn't just exist in a vacuum. At least this is like what I'm arguing. Like, again, I'm not here to blow your minds and change your opinions. I would just like to present hey, here's a different cultural view of what technology could be. And this one where we don't see it as something that's separate from ourselves. Like, it exists in a complicated system that involves the history of us and that object itself before, the laws, the economics, the culture within people of what's actually acceptable to not, like policies, procedures, ideologies about what's important within a piece of technology. So it's not just something that may have evolved separately on its own. It's part of an actual system. It's part of something else within here that brought it to the point where it is now. And the fact where we are now and where we could be in the future is also still part of this complex system. Now, this complex system I'm talking about here is really, just to give a term, what we talk about is society. Between us, us people, our interconnections, the objects and policies and all these things that kind of define and play a role within our life. And so that's, when I talk about society, that's how I am personally viewing it, is that there's more than us, that there's all these complex little webs that connect to other webs of knowing and being and understanding. What do we have for culturals, geographic locations, year and time and age, ability, and what we're actually experiencing. So technology isn't just out there in society, it's also intimately intertwined with us, with the self, with our inner world, and our conscious and unconscious behaviors. This system is often referred to as psychology, like how we think. Because you may think like there's no impact of this at all, but hey, look at us right now watching this video or listening to it, or changing the speed at which you listen to it, or completely not watching it at all, but that won't be the case if you listen to this because you're actually watching or listening to it. Like, this is implicitly impacting you, like what we can have access to in these lectures, how we can actually learn, and it's part of what we do now, and it starts becoming ingrained into what people actually expect. Like the psychology of even education, what's expected nowadays versus back in the day. So one of the themes again of this course is that technology eventually has societal and psychological consequences. And this can be good or bad, but it doesn't mean that this object's thrown out there will be nothing, that it's neutral. I argue that it actually will have an impact of how we think, what we see is important, and what guides us as an overall society. And it's important that we keep our analytical focus on both of these as we take that detective and immigrant kind of perspectives and try to be open, take a step back from our own beliefs and realize there could be something different, and to be skeptical of what we think and also what is just given as common sense and the most acceptable thing that's out there. Like, again, like, how do I know really what's perfect in life? I know it works for me, I know what I believe in, and I would hope to keep learning as I listen to others as well, and admit to cases where I could be wrong. So what is technology? Like, it's not just a thing, it's more than a tool. It's also a system that involves the economics, education, ideas, marketing, science, and finances, and everything about it. Is with a new form of technology, whatever it is, if this is a physical object or if it's a procedure, a way that we're doing something that we view from the world, it's not just itself. Like, this thing could be good, it could be the best thing doing at that job, but that marketing to convince other people could sway their minds to become that's the dominant thing. And just because everyone chose something to be the best doesn't mean it would have actually been the best. Things evolve, different ideas, what effect we have, finances, what people can hold, what allows people to have gain and access to this tool versus not, in that separation. So it's also, like, technology is also a way of thinking, a way of looking at the world that sees the world as something that can be manipulated. Because if we want to use technology, which is something separate from ourselves, to say for different ways of communicating, different tools, even if it's just a shovel itself to move dirt, or to attack someone, who knows, it's a shovel, it's how you use it, then we're viewing that this world can be manipulated and changed, and that we can interact with it, and these tools can better and change what we do within our environment, within our society in some way. So taking a quick step back and just looking even at the etymology of the word, which I'm not going too deep with this, is technically coming from Greek roots, being the science of craft. So tech being like art, skill, cunning of hand, and logi, so technologia, is the study of something or the branch of knowledge of a discipline. Right here, so this is the knowledge of having an art, skill, cunning of hand, and that creativity. And maybe why a lot of times this technology is viewed as progressive change to solving a problem in a craft with which you do something with, say mastering that craft through your tools. So technology being things and techniques is that one way to view technology is physical things and items that we actually have. So techniques, skill, but it can also be techniques, skills, methods, and processes used in the production of things and services. So I would argue even language is a form of technology that's being used of how we convey what we talk about, and there's wide ranges of language, and even within languages that's ever evolving and growing and changing from there, is that language is not a physical thing, but it's something that we use as a technology. And as language evolves itself in different contexts in a societal range, what does that mean? So like just keep in mind again when I'm viewing here that technology is not just physical things. There is a wider range of what you could view technology as actually being, because this is manipulating and changing the world. The paintings themselves as a way to convey messages and impressions and emotions and enjoyment or different things within the actual world, and images could also be viewed as one form of technology and a different way to communicate with people. So technology common view from this, and I would say, like, when I think to myself, when I thought before, and maybe you do, and you may not hold these same beliefs, but a lot of people, when you first think of technology, may think of electronic devices, machines, computers. Then when you say technology, it seems to be the computers what we have today, these smartphones that we use. And it's also then associated with scientific investigation and economics. That if you think of technology, it seems to be that a societal common held view is that science and economics is tied directly to technology and vice versa as these tools. And maybe from science, it's the fact of direct tools for measurement and understanding the world, and economics to get stuff actually done, or a different way to move things within the actual world. And this idea that physical things, electronics, and that can be a common view, but that doesn't mean that that's all that technology really is. When you only limit it, that's one form of technology. And if you branch out further, you can see how they all interrelate and connect together. Another thing is from technology is that it's operated sometimes by individuals that may not have a detailed knowledge of the workings of these things. Like if you drive a car, some of you would probably have intimate knowledge with everything about that actual vehicle, all those actual parts. Some of you may not. It may have what you need as a functional case to operate and use that form of technology. And so there is cases with technology being this item of how we interact with it, that we sometimes need a lot of knowledge to know the inner workings, but sometimes we don't always need to know everything and we're able to use it. And this could be argued that suggesting that technology is intelligence solidified. It is our knowledge and wisdom. This is other work and other people have gone into this to understand and make this tool, and then abstract to a point where, okay, well, you can use this, you can know how you can interface with it. You don't need to understand every step of it, but you'll be able to get stuff done, which then also kind of creates the case where maybe you're becoming controlled and dependent upon that technology by not knowing what it is. But who knows? The world is a complex case, so when I deal with complexity, I try to abstract away and deal with what I can handle now and update and change as we go. Even looking back to the car analogy, if we go deeper, is that people may have intimate knowledge of how vehicles work, but what may not know about material strengths and understand the deeper science that may come from other fields, which is another form of technology that designed the materials that is then used to build stuff to make cars to other cases. And it's all this form of technology that we actually have and come to that we can keep using and not needing to know everything else. And it is a common view. I would say that for even some people in this classroom, like, you may be using a computer, but how much do you know about every step of it? Some people may have more intimate knowledge from IT, or some may have no more from their background of doing some programming and understand like, okay, well, okay, I understand this, but I don't know everything, say, about the operating system that's on this machine. Maybe you know how to build computers and fix them, maybe you don't, but we're still using them to get stuff done. There's still a wealth of actual knowledge and history that comes into everything that's in this physical device that you have, all the common forms of this. And again, it's not separated from that web, that the device you picked, like, why? Was it marketing? Was it some kind of connection? Who told you? What connection to other people did you have? What about the previous history of the physical materials that are in the device? From those scientists and the back knowledge and other people that developed this? What about the designers and artists that also dealt with aesthetic uses and designing to work with people and that human-computer interaction, that connections between there? Like, there's a lot in every device that we see that we just kind of take for granted sometimes. Now, technology is another view from it being like that craft side of it. We talked from that original word from the Greek kind of roots to study the skill of this. And if it's a craft, it suggests creation and it suggests culture. And maybe this is a stretch for like logical steps, but if it's a craft, it's something you're doing, it's something you're building. So you need to create. If you're crafting something, it came from something that wasn't before, or modifying what was to make something new. And those crafts then start becoming part of an actual culture. Like, can technology exist without people? I don't know. Today, not really. And I'm not saying there's physical people, there's entities. That's why I got a picture here of an actual, like, raven or crow that's using a tool, just a form of technology. It's a physical one to do something, to manipulate and change the actual world. Well, we don't need people, but there's got to be something that is using that technology and creating it in the beginning right now. I create, therefore it is. I don't know, going weirdly off of a Descartes, like, I think, therefore I am weird argument. But, like, can it exist separately? Right here is like, I guess what I'm trying to get to more here is that culture, that's still a connection, that creating craft and technology and what we're using is that we're taking what we have to make something new, making tools or different ways we can manipulate the actual world. And that came out of an actual culture and design choices and why it's used and what gets adopted versus what doesn't get adopted and what goes away versus what goes forwards, and how it's used as that culture and economics and that wide web of everything else around there. And that exists within that culture. And again, at least as we're existing now, I'd argue that like technology doesn't exist without people or other entities, but who knows what the future is? What about machines making other machines and not needing human input at that point in time? What could that be? Now, looking at technology overall, you can think of like a Venn diagram that this is a subset of that original thing of technology. We also now have the common term nowadays of information technology. And like, what distinguishes these two separate terms? And the point that we're getting to more nowadays is the fact of how much data and information that we have access to and that we view for ease of access. What is the difference now when we look at things like the normal view of technology versus information technology? Now, going based upon definitions, if we can start at some starting point, information technology as a noun is the study or use of systems, especially computers and telecommunication, for storing, retrieving, and sending information, sometimes abbreviated as IT. So information technology. And it's something that we just take for granted nowadays. Like, this is a given. We're used to this, of emails, data being collected, analyzing data, the emerging fields of data sciences, everything from like new currencies of Bitcoin to everything else is this idea of information, of storing, retrieving, and doing work with it. And how you store that information, how you work with it, starts becoming its own form of actual technology. And these are things that data scientists and other people and like computer scientists and BCIS students work with, manipulating and working with and understanding these structures to get work done. And this is a common thing that we work with. So when we think of this, again, with information technology, there's a lot part of it that we can't physically grasp, but they're things that we use, like programming languages and the tools that we use. And it's not just for the realm of people and computer scientists or people or computer people, is that nowadays a lot of businesses, that people that work with information that have to tabulate and bring that together, marketing, PR, social media, everything else like that, is that we have this growing field. And so it is a form of technology, but just narrowing it down to being like you're working of storing and retrieving data and working with this information, and what does that mean overall? So information technology plays a significant role in all aspects of our modern society. Like, it has changed the way in which we communicate with each other, how we find needed information, work, conduct business, interact with government agencies, and how we manage our social lives. Now, people can argue in different generations and different parts of the world this doesn't play as big of a role, but us right now in this class and using these videos in whatever way we communicate, it becomes a given of what becomes expected within this, so that we're using this information technology to actually communicate. Like the fact that I can record this video so easily at home using multiple forms of different technology, upload it to social media sites like YouTube and other course learning software. You can get notified, you can watch it at your pace, at your time. You can change then and manipulate that information for how fast or if at all you do it, and analyzing it. Like, it plays a role of how we communicate, how we're affected by other people. And so you may not be part of that system as much, but it will end up affecting you at some point in time because it's become so ingrained within society. Choices that are made by policymakers can be made based upon information that's collected from surveys and other sources that then impacts your life. And they're using these tools. You driving your vehicle and the systems that are within it. The systems that then control automated systems for lighting while you're doing traffic and other work, that information systems are being applied. And so you may not explicitly yourself be using it or viewing it, but that doesn't mean that it isn't out there having an impact. Hey, let alone scheduling of classes that we have in a university. That's generally done by other software, and that's analyzing the actual data to make decisions about what to do. So it is having an impact. So today, innovations in information technology are having wide-ranging effects across numerous domains of society, and policymakers are acting on issues involving economic productivity, intellectual property rights, privacy protection, and affordability of and access to information. And as things change, because everything nowadays with like Bitcoins and NFTs, which I have no personal background with, maybe I'm just an old fogey for that yet, but it's not an area that I've spent enough time to research in here. But there's a whole new industry that's impacting people that I know. Some people in this course, it may be an intimate thing that you're part of that. Others, it could be that you're not part of it at all, but it's still having an effect somewhere within the world. If it's not actually economical changes for the future, what about environmental costs of running such systems, to policies that have to be put in place when this is a whole new forms of currency, so forth. So things are changing in our world around us, in this idea of information technology and the fact that it is impacting us. Now, the rest of these slides, I'm just going to be presenting some viewpoints, like 4 different viewpoints on technology and society. And I'm not saying, again, that this is the end all and be all of what I'm presenting is what has to be. They're just kind of starting points to branch off in conversations about what are maybe some common views of technology and society from right here. What are some good or bad issues about them? What are counter views of it? And then maybe you can think, well, how does this relate to yourself? Have you ever thought about this? If you have the fact that you think, well, this doesn't matter at all, well, that maybe it doesn't matter to you, but sure, it probably matters to someone else out there. Is this important for society to think about or not? Like, I think it is, because these are having effects, and it's like impacting other people for positive benefits and negative effects as well. And so just because my own personal experiences with it may not say there's any changes, there could be for someone else. So either way, again, not here to tell you what to think, just want to present you with some new data that you can form into information, knowledge, and your wisdom, and kind of adapt it into your own systems and see where you take it from there. And I just hope that it broadens your view of society and the field you're in, and don't think of it just as a field and that you are separated from it, because you're not. You are interconnected with a whole lot of other systems and cultures and ways of knowing and being. So take the following viewpoints as a starting point for conversations, like in dialogues and discussions we have in the class or posts that we may have. To think of, like, what would you say about this? What does it mean? Do you have any emotional connections to it? Who knows? Maybe have no feelings at all, which is also perfectly okay. So viewpoint 1, thinking that technology is the only or main driver of change in the life world or our world around us. Being that really only big changes come around, like, well, not the other things may happen, but technology becomes this big driving force to change where we are at as a society, and like drastic shifts. If we're going from the use of basic tools, fire, weapons, bronze metals, atomic bombs, like, what does it mean for the automobile versus previous industries of like horse and buggy and other forms of locomotion? What does it mean for internet systems that we have nowadays and computers that we use, and like how our society is different from the way it was in the past? That there's still similar issues that transport themselves forwards, but that we have shifted how we think and what we expect as an overall society, and technology being that driving force from here. And we're going to come over this later on. It's called technological determinism, and it is one view that people have held, and you can see that some people have it so ingrained within themselves. So again, like this viewpoint 1, that technology is the bigger change, is the belief here is that our society and the world remains relatively static until the invention of new revolutionary technologies that force changes in the life world and people around us. Now, I'm not saying this is a view you have to get. This is just a view that some people have taken, or is analyzing how people think, is that technology becomes that first driving point. So if we invest in technology and we use it and we innovate and we come up with new things, we can bring out social change. We can change society through the technology and those communication viewpoints. Now, maybe you're thinking, where does society come within that? Where does people and the individuals, where does culture, religion, and other things come into play? That's branching points for different viewpoints. But some people do view this, that technology becomes that main force, and that becomes a decision of, what do I adapt? What do I invest in? What do I want to actually see for the future? So again, this ignores social and psychological aspects into it. So if it's not the technology, what was the social and the people? What are psychological aspects, being that cultural and everything else that's around there? And often so this is ingrained in our identity and culture. We don't even see the technologies we use that include within ourselves. So this is just one first viewpoint to take that we can analyze a little bit later in the course. And maybe when you view other people or view yourself, do you see that technology plays that bigger changing force? Like, will it change? Is it only technology? Is there a balance between society and between, or is it just overall society, or is it nothing at all? Because I'd say it would. Like I say, technology has a big impact. Even if you look at education, if you think to yourself, the things you'd list out as a student, you expect. Now, within teaching, and especially this environment, is there's certain things that people now expect that you have to have, that you have to be given these things. You have to have these pre-recorded lectures to give to us that we can then go back at and look at time. And, well, there's information technology, the fact that you can go back and review what was already taught. You don't have to just be there at that time to listen, that you can reanalyze that. And that can be a huge benefit for people, the different times it takes people to learn. Or it could be the other side is like, oh, I just don't want to do this now. I want to reorganize and optimize what I'm doing, and I have to work to do these things. And so learning will be shoved into this little time later and offsets what you're doing, which can also be good, but then it becomes an expectation that's ingrained within us. So really, was it the technology that was changing education, or was it the choice of people within the education environment that then was changing how that technology was actually being used? Or is it some kind of combination between the actual two of them? So an alternate view from viewpoint 1 is maybe a coevolution as a better way of looking at technology and humans. That each party in a coevolution relationship exerts selective pressures on the other, thereby affecting each other's evolution. So technology growing and changing over time, and humans and societies changing over time, is that this coevolution back and forth of which ones are actually changing this. And so just like that previous view I said it was called technological determinism that we're going to be talking about later in the course, here this would be more called social construction of technology. So I think it's Scott from right here, but social constructivism kind of idea of this coevolution between society and growth of what becomes important. And here, I'm not saying these are the only views, I'm just presenting two different things to think about what has an impact, because if we view this as coevolution and we bring back in people into this, then maybe when we analyze stuff, investing in people instead of technologies and things can have an impact. Maybe investing in what we do culturally as a group and understanding those cultural groups that we're working with and understanding them beyond just our own views, that they have different worldviews of what could that mean, and that evolution and that choice. And evolution here, not always saying that we're going for a progressive view. It could just be evolution as in a change, which could be good or bad. Okay. Viewpoint 2. Thinking that technology is just a neutral tool. So it's a thing. It's a thing. That's an object itself. It's just something that's there. Even with information technology, it's just data that's there. And being a neutral tool, that this is more the ethics. It's not good or bad. There's not morals embedded within it. Just a neutral tool. So interestingly, this one is also deeply ingrained in the popular image. The belief here is that technology has no ethical content. Rather, it is the individuals using them, rightly or wrongly, that causes this. And there's a whole wider range of this that comes out of it. And like, again, I'm not going to say it's one point and that everything is going to be either neutral or everything is going to be it has connections to it, but there are cases where it has ethical implications embedded into a device that may be purposefully put there or not or unintentionally put there. Devices that like have certain requirements may neglect part of the population or people who don't have those same, say, physical capabilities. If this is some device and someone cannot use it due to a different limitation or a physical ailment that they may have, so blind, if you're deaf and you can't listen and you can't see stuff, and then colorblind, visual colors and other effects like that, like things that can separate stuff, then maybe there's unintended consequences and moral issues that will then come out of that, and what's done with those actual devices. This view also seems like common sense, that it's neutral, that a tool or technology is neutral and doesn't have an effect and doesn't have anything embedded within it. Because, like, hey, if we go for your crazy teacher's example, after all, it is not the inventor of the toaster's fault that a grumpy short-order cook once murdered someone by throwing a toaster at a waiter's head. It's not the toaster that was morally evil. It was the waiter's actions of using the toaster that then caused that to happen. And that's true. That is this coevolution in society together, that there is things that are embedded into a device about how they're used as the tool at the time of it, but sometimes there's things that are embedded into the actual choices themselves of why that technology came out, was designed due to moral choices or had unintended consequences from what you expected. And also, like, getting back to this idea of common sense is what really is common sense. Like, common sense people keep saying, oh, this is just stupid. Why don't you just know that? And I'm like, well, how were you told that? Like, where did that come from? Is common sense just an omnipresent being that we all get infected with? And if you don't know that common sense, you haven't been infected with this? Like, how does this relate to the data, information, knowledge, and wisdom kind of model that I presented, if we're using that as a way, an epistemological way that people ingrained? And like, if we look at the DIKW kind of model as a way of looking to common sense, is common sense could have been learned. Common things that are shared within society that become customs that are trained explicitly or explicitly through observations that just become, this is what we do because this is what we have seen, and this is what a group of people have agreed upon is a good thing to do, and it just gets taught into people and becoming that, well, I know this, why don't other people know this? This is within this case, which then begs to differ that sometimes common sense can be different from person A to person B to person C. And whatever cases you had, and there's different backgrounds. So just falling back to common sense, it's nice to question to be like, well, this is what I commonly know. Doesn't mean it always has to be from right here. And then how can those things be changed, even embedded within the technology that we use? So a problem that could come up with this thinking is that technologies are neutral, is that some technologies are not. Like, some are from neutral, but some aren't. They might be predisposed to certain type of social outcomes based upon what's embedded within that technology in those words. That they are not neutral, what's embedded from here. How we use language could be neutral in the beginning, but there's a lot of built up belief of what can happen and what one word as a part of communication can do to someone else. Because words themselves, yes, are just a form of technology and may be neutral, but there is the cultural, historical, economic, finances, emotional, psychological impacts that come behind what's embedded in the meaning of those actual words themselves. That to one group it may be common sense that there's nothing bad with that, but then to another group this is horribly bad, and how this changes over time. So another problem is that technologies can have a moral component in their creation and design, or the purpose and use, sometimes unanticipated. So that the tool may be neutral, but the designer and creator and society that around it may have had morals that judge based upon the way it's actually designed. And then the purposes and uses of it that are sometimes unanticipated may come out, could end up having different moral reasons that come. So good or bad or whatever else. And it's not really neutral at that time. It gets embedded due to the actual use itself. Taking a very morbid example from this is looking at things like the guillotine as a form of technology to lop the head off thy fellow individual for some there darn reason. It's a technology that we may look at and see like, well, if it's just the form, it's just metal, it's just the parts, it's what's there. And like, how did this come about as a form of technology? Like, is the guillotine the thing that's bad, or is it everything else behind that? Is it the French Revolution being part of this and the people that had the moral things? Or like, why was this actually designed? And so if we look into it itself a little further for the history, is that like a guillotine is an apparatus designed for the efficiently carrying out executions by beheading. Kind of creepy to read those words of efficiency if we're trying to take off people's heads. It was invented with the specific intention of making capital punishment more humane in accordance with the Enlightenment's ideas as a society at that time, the Enlightenment period in Europe. As previous methods of execution in France had proven to be substantially more painful and prone to error. That would be taking an axe or a sword and just going at it. There's a lot more bigger things beyond this of just saying like capital punishment as a form of technology and why that's needed too, if it's needed. and what does it do society-wise. I'm not getting to that in this course, but you can see if it starts making you think about stuff differently of being a tool neutrally, is the tool itself could be neutral, but it was designed specifically that to be not just efficient, but they're trying to actively be humane. There could have been other forms of technology to deal with, like not having to kill people in this way, but they could have just continued with the old traditional fashion ways that we did back in the day, just take that swing of a sword, which generally didn't just, like in the movies, lop someone's friggin' head off with one swing. It could take multiple swings, or if they missed, or if anything else that happened, and the fact that that could be extremely traumatizing or more painful to someone. And you think, like, who cares? They're going to die anyways. What do we care? Well, that's a moral choice from right here, and someone else's moral choice that they still went for, thinking that capital punishment was needed, but we don't need to then use technology that requires harm to the individual for excessive amounts of torturous time. And so the guillotine as itself within it, when we look at it, is a form of technology that could be neutral, but it was designed out of moralistic and society reasons that got embedded within it as its choices. And also the idea that capital punishment itself is why it came out from right here. And do we use this nowadays? I don't know. This whole thing of how we've evolved from those times and changed, of good or bad or change, who knows? But this is a case where some devices have different cases that they may not just be neutral. They could have things that are embedded within them first culturally, and the fact that there are morals and the reasons why it may came out, and that had an impact on it. Viewpoint 2, like another problem with this, is that some technologies might also include certain personality or cognitive changes regardless of the designer's desires. So this is more that you may have designed a device to use a technology, but then the way society starts using it and how it changes society becomes different and starts having those moralistic impacts, that it's not neutral, it has impacts. And as we know, like I would think anything I know nowadays is whatever I create, there's always going to be someone who takes it in a different way and uses it in a way that we didn't think. And how it gets adopted. So like what new words get adopted within languages over time. And it'll take cognitive changes regardless of the designer's desire, whatever I had as that separate, that there's something that gets embedded within it. And then once it's free from us as that creation, how will it change society and how will society change it? So can you think of any examples? And this is something I'll probably bring up for discussion, that being post-premiere, of like examples that how technology has been used in different ways than we expected and then changed people's personalities of what we've done. As I said, education is one of those, of how that's changed people's cognitive way of behaving. It is that you may have designed stuff like YouTube sharing sites. I really doubt it began as a way of an educational tool as well as just sharing. But now with these video sources we have now and what we're doing, how can we be educated by that, and how is that ingrained within our society, and how is it being used? And then what do we expect? Like even now with video sources and ease of access of internet and devices to be able to do this, is that we can offset when we do something. Instead of always having to be forced to be at a specific place in a certain time to be part of a lecture, you can now watch these videos and listen to me blather on in my office. It also takes other cognitive changes that I have to adapt as I talk, is that I'm not talking to other people. Like I'm having a one-sided conversation that you're listening to and you're interacting with, and you're doing this, but I'm not getting the feedback now from the students in the room and the people that I'm with. And so where is the dialogue as part of that? And so I have to shift how I react and what I do and how I talk. And that's one example as a shift of like cognitive changes that was not expected by this technology, not expected by teaching, and not the way when I did it and was taught back in the day, and the way I was taught versus way it is now, what becomes commonly ingrained. And so it's not really as much of a neutral tool to me anymore. So believing that technology is neutral is too often simply an intellectual escape from the moral obligations and complications that are often involved with working within IT. And I don't know, that can be fine. Like, I can't deal with everything all the time, so sometimes I just deal with what I can deal with now. And maybe you're making that choice to step back from it, but fine, that's a choice, but it doesn't mean it's still not there. That there isn't things that are still being impacted of the form of technology you create, of how it could have a positive impact. You could have designed it that way, but then it starts having a negative impact. Look at social media. Like, I think it's still a valuable tool that I stay connected with people I don't see on a regular basis. And that's its original intention, but now there's so much more behind the scenes of what it means for data and analyzing people without knowing this is happening, and then how policies are now coming into place to try to protect people from what, from a company standpoint, having this data and making decisions was good, righteously and unethically to them, but to others this was so wrong to have this stolen without this being known and being manipulated. Cases of where social media can be negative and have negative impacts, and how do we balance that interaction and change those within society? Like, I sure as hell don't know, but it is a case that, like, I will strongly argue that no matter what, if you say this doesn't impact, I'll say it does. I won't like dock you marks if you don't think the same way as I do, but it's just a strong thing that I've seen how it's impacted people. Me being a teacher at the front of the room, I can see a wide range of students that I've worked with over the years and over the time, and I can see in the same classroom. And sometimes I get students that say this doesn't impact them, but they're not seeing that student that's next to them that didn't tell them of how something, some form of technology, something else had an impact on them. And even when it wasn't their intention, even if you thought it didn't have an issue, it meant something strongly to someone else. And why I think this course is important, and why I think it's important to take a time to step back from just learning your technological skills and your tools with whatever you are, and realize it has an impact within society. That technology, whatever form and design that you put with it and how you use it, has an overall impact. Or maybe I'm just like old person-y ranting off on stuff, but take it or leave it, just conversation. So viewpoint 3. Thinking that the real-world consequences of a technology are directly related to its functional capabilities. So being by whatever form of technology you have, only looking at it as its objective functionalities of what it does, right here, is that this is what has real-world consequences. So, look at little Henry, the vacuum cleaner here. What is the functional capabilities of a toaster? Like a vacuum cleaner. Facebook. Like a toaster. Make toast. Like, what do you think? That's the company. You put it in. You put in some kind of carbohydrates or some other form of some kind of edible something, you would hope. And then it heats it up and change its properties to make it all crispy and yummy in the way that you like, in whatever shade of toasting that you like, in whatever way. Like a vacuum cleaner is supposed to suck up that dirt and make it easier for us and other tools. Facebook, communicate, terrorize people, do whatever you want, laugh at silly memes as we exchange them in pictures in society right now. Like, for instance, like, look at the functional capabilities of the household technologies such as the vacuum and the washing machines. One might expect that they reduce the amount of time needed to do housework. So what will we do? What will be the consequences of all that free time? Like, think about what you have nowadays when you think, okay, well, I need a laundry machine, and that's used to have it common at home. Maybe I have a shared one within a building I have to. Maybe I have to transport it to a laundromat if I don't have access to machines within my place. Like, what becomes us to be expected to do that? Because cleaning clothes is an important thing. I think we've agreed upon that as a society as we balance it. But I don't know, I'm generally like a mix of clean to gruffy, scruffy, whatever. And staying away from putrid levels, but whatever. From here, but it takes time. And if you're taking clothing that we have, it takes time to clean it. And if you had to do that within your day when you're busy. So what do you do now when you have a machine that you can walk away from and it does it for you? What does that mean now that within this day of a common tasks, what can we now do with that time? Or how does it change our perception of what can be done within time and that scheduling? And what is then expected? And how dependent upon these devices are we to use them to do stuff for us? So a possibility is a device that lowers effort will increase expectations for the amount that can be done. So societal changes could change how new technology is used. New technology could enable new social changes. So you're freed up from cleaning, you're freed up from eating, and well, eating from right here, that could be different, but freed up from like prepping food. What does that mean? Like at the time of recording like this video, there are so many services out there now for fast delivery of food. If you're Uber Eats or whatever else, you're using whatever exists from right here is that getting food for delivery. Delivery services for other boxed meals or prep meals of not having to go for groceries. What does that mean? That it could be a luxury that you have, or maybe for someone where mobility is an issue and that separation is that we don't, it opens up doors for access, could potentially from here. Maybe there's less social interaction because now I don't need to travel to some place and have to interact with people, which could be good. I'm an isolationist at some times, but I crave some kind of communication with other people. Like, what are these unintended consequences that are going to come out of this? And that simple thing of it's a laundry machine, I put in laundry. I'm like, yeah, but now while it's doing laundry, you can do something else than sitting there down by the creek cleaning that damn shirt to get that stain out. Like, it takes different things. And what does it mean? And there's other obligations, environmental, that then come out of this, and expectations. If you had to clean a lot of clothes, how much clothing would you keep? How much would you buy and have clothes that's full if it took you a long time to continuously clean all of these clothing? Would that change how you would buy clothing? Like, there are other consequences that are beyond just the functionality of this washes clothing. Well, now that I have this free time, I can do more with it. And what else? So the first step we should take when thinking about social consequences of technology is to remember how rarely technologies achieve their promise, and indeed how many do the opposite. So like, we design it, we use it, but there's always going to be like unintended consequences of benefit or good or bad of how they're used and changed. And then maybe that drives the change of technology within the actual future itself. So coevolution-y thing again, which probably I'll have a bias because I lean more towards of a coevolution kind of view. So in other words, it is very difficult, if not impossible, to predict the ultimate effects of the introduction of a new technology. Too often, prognosticators, so people who try to foretell prophecies of the future events, so trying to predict what could be the next big thing. Right here, too many times the predictions based on functional capabilities, and thus it is usually a mistake. Like, you should probably branch out and look at the societal other things. You can look at patterns, make a prediction, use some abductive reasoning where you can see logical patterns, but you will work based upon probabilities to make what could happen, but be aware that things will shift and change, and maybe we can shift and change within the future. And even if it's good now, maybe it's going to have things that we don't expect that comes out of this, and there's different ways we can co-evolve with our technology instead of just being this neutral, separate tool that we don't think about, that we create, that we throw into the world and think, it's not my fault. So it was easy to predict the invention of cars. Right here. So in the 1860s and 1870s, improvements in the capabilities and affordability of steel and rubber, the shrinking size of steam and then internal combustion engines, the dramatic growth in the new petroleum industry, and the burgeoning social desires for individual control over mobility all pointed to the possibility of the invention of the automobile. And indeed, there are many of these forecasters that did so in the 1880s and shifted their investment, seeing what's next. Maybe this is what people are doing now with Bitcoin and NFTs, if they believe that that's what their functionalities could have a bigger social change for impacts for what they see in the future. I'm not going into an argument about that. In the first decades of the automobile, so 1890s to 1900s, futurists thought that the key social consequences of the car would be huge growth in the servant employment sector due to the greater need for chauffeurs. So you can see cultural and moralistically where these views were coming from who would actually be driving and who would be doing the driving, the separation. And the dramatic growth in farming as people leave cities to live in the country. Because now that I don't have to be at the city to get commerce done, I can transport myself further, and I don't need to be in the cities, and I will live on the farms. I don't know, from some side from right here. So that's what they were predicting. But no one predicted traffic jams. No one predicted the transformation of teenage sexuality enabled by cars. Sounds fucking weird, but hey, need a place to do it in privacy maybe? Cars can take you there. Cars can shield you. I won't say any more from that, but you can take whatever you want from it. Like, there's unintended consequences, what we had from here. How are cities now designed due to automobiles? Like, what we expect for parking lots? How are roads designed? How is mobility within a city designed? How are cities laid out? And automobiles become such a dominant form that what was designed for a city back in the day versus new. Like, just look at the design of cities in general and say, go to the old parts of towns where things may not have changed. Wonder, why are the roads like this? Why is it difficult to get around? Versus, say, newer communities that are being designed that maybe they're designed more around the actual vehicles. And how did that shift? So just go look at old maps, old layouts of cities, the old parts of communities you're in, and why is that different from newer communities? And what changes over time as older areas are destroyed and new things are created or they're intertwined together? And what does that do? And so, like, again, no one predicted these things. Why? Because they were outcomes that required integrating deep knowledge of the actual world around in the context and foreseeing how it was done. Not just the functional capabilities of car make me move. Car can do different things. Car needs someone to do it to drive it. Is like people use cars to do other things because now you have some freedom and there's a new way to use it that wasn't embedded in there. I don't think the designer of the car was first thinking about having people do it in the car. Don't know, maybe they did, but they would have maybe designed it differently for that, if that's that case. But like, I doubt it, but it's used, and now how does that shift things? Even if we go into the future now to try to predict of what happens with like autonomous vehicles if this continues, and how will that be changed? Like, what could we predict now, and what could we see per versus what if we take in a social cultural aspect, and does it actually need to change or go forwards? Who knows? So we tend to be overly focused on the immediate and short-term consequences, which can be more easily foreseen, which is fine, and this tends to exclude considerations of long-term consequences. And we can't see and predict and deal with everything, but we should know it can have an impact out there. We should be able to analyze and say we change over time and realize that there could be longer-term changes of what happens to technology to us. And as you expect, this would be unintended consequences. Giving it some kind of terminology to talk about it, those things that we don't see, the unintended. We intended certain things to happen, unintended things come out of it. So in sociology, this is sometimes referred to as more generally as the problem of unintended consequences, and that social actions, such as the invention, adoption of a technology, may have outcomes that are not foreseen or for what it's intended or intended. And so again, this can become that cultural, society, moral, policies, everything else. Maybe new things were adopted way more now, especially with, say, our online during the pandemic, teaching what forms of technology then grew faster during that time due to circumstances beyond here. What about moral changes, and how is that defining what's done? Like California's laws on being able to fix devices and how long they're actually maintained for. And what does that actually do for us as a society versus the general acceptance of the obsolescence nature of technology, that there will be a new phone, a new computer, a new car type next year, and you want the new thing, and the status symbols that are then associated with that. So unintended consequences don't, again, always mean things that there's bad. There's things like unintended benefits, unexpected. So things like aspirin being used to relieve other pain, but that ends up helping heart attacks, preventing heart attacks. Unexpected drawback. The popularization of word processing software resulting in decline in spelling knowledge, i.e. me, as a teacher, an issue that I have. Self-driving cars will likely create a few large driving companies who control aspects of transportation. Like, what does it mean for Tesla and you're paying for software features in a vehicle and you have an update and it fucks up what you can do to that physical car? Like, what does it mean for that control? Cloud computing ends up being so profitable that it bankrolls the takeover of most consumer purchasing. If this is Amazon to other things, to cloud computing and services, what we use to become dependent upon, that our apps behind the scenes and that flow of information becomes so dominant within it. Or perverse results, being the opposite of what was intended completely, that it was created for one reason, but used for something completely different. So unfortunately, lots of examples here, like the improvements in sports equipment in football and hockey were meant to reduce the risk of injury, have largely increased injury rates in some cases. Word processors were meant to increase the productivity of typists, but evidence indicates it does the opposite within that actual design of it, of how fast can you type to do your work and do the rest of it, and how we're doing things. Even changing people writing by hand. My handwriting's horrible, but I've seen other people like, how long can you write things now with your hands that before it starts hurting, like on an exam or on a test? What does that have as an effect? We're doing good so far, coming near the end. This is the last viewpoint. We're just 54 minutes into this in this video, which in normally a lecture this would take me longer, but I find with me just blathering here right now and not reacting to the crowd of people in front of me, I react differently to how I teach. I go off topic less. I'm, for some reason, less inappropriate, and I swear less through the videos, and in class I swear more. Don't know why. Probably people. I blame myself, not people, but just being around people and how I react. Either way, back on topic. So the viewpoint 4, the revolutionary impact of technological change. So viewpoint 4, like the view here that's commonly held, common knowledge, you could call it. We are constantly encouraged to believe that we are living in a world of constant innovation and deeply transformative, even exponential change. That we are always growing, always changing, and we are at this pinnacle of this point where we are now, and it's growing crazy. This one seems common sense, but is only really true if one plots technologies on a time graph that extends from way back in the creation of the day to present day. If one's graph is 100,000 years long, that absolutely technology change appears exponential. Going from back in the day to now, that this growth goes exponential, a curve going greatly up. But if one condenses that chart to just the past 200 years, then one will see that the rate of technological change appears to be slowing. The time period that witnessed the greatest technological change was actually the 1880s to 1920s, and the 1950s, 1960s was the next biggest one. These two time periods also saw drastic changes in the social realm of what was our society at all. And people tend to confuse improvements within a technology with actual new technologies. So that's one thing, is like there's massively changed things in technology for motion, even having automobiles and having planes. But there's one thing from going from a phone to a smartphone, which is just a merging of other technologies, but then how people use it. Even maybe arguing stuff with Bitcoin, NFTs, that this is just new forms of commerce, but it's still commerce, and a switch to digital side. But I won't make claims more because I'm not an expert at all in these things, but it could just be a shift. Now, your teacher's experience. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but I want you to more think of reflecting back on your own experiences from your age time. Like everyone within this class is going to be of different ages. Like there may be a common core of who's here, but this is an option course, certain level, but I'll get people who could be like younger to older within here in experiences. And at the time of recording this video, like your teacher's 40 years old. And I could be like, back in my day, sitting on my porch, you young and don't know how good you have it. Back in my day, I didn't have these things. And I'm like, if I just go with my experiences of being 40 versus someone else's, like view for me growing up is like the internet when I was a kid and younger was not a thing or even a thought within my head. Like that just didn't exist in the public realms. I was born in the 80s. And so being a kid first starting off is like, yeah, like TV at home and what that meant, still going to school, how you communicate with people, maybe have access to the phone. Cell phones weren't a thing. Going to school at a younger age, even going on to university and high school, like going to high school and university. For me, like again, like it first started interacting with computers was not something I had at home. It was something that was in the school, like old green screen computers right there. And then like later on, having access to the internet only happened at the school at later times as we were introduced to it and what it was. And even for me, when I started university, I didn't have the internet at home. for myself. So my first year's university is like, well, going into computer science, and I've learned what this was, but if I needed to have access to the internet and do anything else, and how much I used it was different because I had to go to the university to get it. Like, I had to check email for the school, but I couldn't check it from home. I couldn't check it from my phone. I didn't have a smartphone. It was like that. I had to go to the school to do that. And what was accessible for the knowledge to learn? There was no Stack Overflow back in my day, or Reddit or other forums like that I knew of. Like, I know that there was like other systems that were out there, but it wasn't part of what I dealt with. And so my first experiences of learning and what I expected was different versus maybe what you expect nowadays, of knowing that you have these videos, you have this access, that you can then also become the educator and create, and you can post content yourself and easily have a system to distribute that to others and figure out algorithms that could be manipulating me or manipulating us, like whatever. Like, things have changed over time, and there's been unintended consequences that I've seen of like something I thought was good and how they were used, how smartphones are used within a class to other devices, how classrooms are now designed themselves around the technology that's expected in education. Like, how long do batteries and laptops use? Access to actually plug in and charge devices. You can just even take a look at that going across campus here at Mount Royal. Go to older parts versus new parts. Like, the library itself is newer than like the Lincoln Park building, and realize, well, how are they designed and what new forms of technology become favored or become important within it, and then how are they being used? So it's changing. But I won't rant on too much longer. We're now hitting an hour into this like video here, but that's just my experiences. But sit back and reflect on your own. So remember that while sometimes an improvement in a technology might be considered new technology, i.e. smartphones, was an improvement in existing cell phone technologies, but most of the time they're merely an improvement, smaller or faster, that doesn't essentially change how they are used or have that big of an impact. And there could be bigger things that come out of this and the impacts go beyond it, but there's a wider range of what's actually happening. And maybe we may be changing, but that view that there will always be something new. It's getting kind of ingrained into me and what people get used to. So like, some people are in computer science, other fields, you're going to have to learn, as I've learned, that like what you learn now is going to change by the time you're out there. And while you're in the field, it's always going to change. And sometimes maybe it doesn't need to change. Maybe what was there before was good, and it doesn't always need to be improved upon. I say with quotes right now that you can't see. So you might ask yourself, who benefits from everyone thinking that technological change is speeding up dramatically? Like, what do we need from that? Like, who benefits from it versus who doesn't? What does this mean for age? Like, what I understand about technology and how I relate to people, to other people who are younger, to who are older. What does that mean when it comes to ageism? In that case of like, everything makes sense to you now, but things may not make sense in the future when things change and you realize time goes by. I'm not saying my experience, maybe you won't experience, maybe your whole area will be different. Who knows? I'm just blathering on to like an empty screen right now after an hour. So maybe I'm going hallucinating, but again, ask yourself, like, who benefits from everyone thinking that technological change is speeding up dramatically? It's a good discussion question. Now, this is where I'll leave you off with this reading. So, predicting the market evolution of computers, was the revolution really unforeseen? From right here to relate from this. So a little bit of sociology, kind of scientific background research into evaluating what did people think versus did they see it? Was it really unforeseen? Is it really something new? Is it emerging of technologies, or what happened? From right here. So things to think about this is, how has IT changed the world and why? This reading will work as prep for next week in kind of relation to what we also had from this week to next week and everything else. So read through it and get a context, and be aware these are things that you can then draw upon when it comes to future assignments or anything within the course or tests from right here. Okay. And you should see in a separate video where I continue on with the actual paper itself. Or maybe not separate. I think I'll start a new tradition like I did in the last video and just change my mind right now, is I thought the text-to-speech may work well for some people. It works for me, may not work for others. You may not have access to that same tool, so If you give me a second, I'm going to pause the video so you'll see it. For you, it'll just blip. The new thing is I'm going to bring up the actual paper, and I am going to turn on the text-to-speech to go through it, so you can now listen to the actual paper itself if you want to. So if you don't, you're free to go, free to stop with the rest of this lecture, and just remember, once again, you're awesome. If you think you're not, I disagree with you. I am correct, and I will believe in my fallacy stronger than your fallacy. From right here, but I think it's just more of like, please just try to take care of yourself. Like, it's that one first step. If you do the things to take care of yourself and acknowledge the things that you may not be doing as good as you think you are, you can maybe work and help yourself to become a better person. You can also then maybe by helping yourself, you can help then other people around you. And maybe as overall society and whatever we have these forms of technology, and maybe I can impart with this is that like I care. Like, I don't know all of you and what time and who's watching this, but I do care. I may not understand everyone. I don't know how to relate with everyone, but I do care. And I hope that you learn to care about yourself and care about other people around you, and realize that we all have impacts on each other, and we may have intended consequences where we want to do good, but it could result in bad. And how do we grow and learn and change as a society? As I would hope that the majority of us just don't want to cause harm to others. Okay, so either way there. You can stop, you can go free, or otherwise you can continue on in a second here as I start the actual text-to-speech software. I am pausing now. And we're back. I have opened up the reading. I've got Natural Reader set up here, and I'm now just going to let it go so we can both listen to the paper and think and reflect on it right now. Okay. I will just pause my microphone so it doesn't pick it up, and then
Predicting the market evolution of computers. Was the revolution really unforeseen? Abstract. This is a study of how people viewed the future prospects for computers from their inception in the mid-1940s to their establishment as an unequivocal market success in 1964. Based on a reading of the published record, it compares two hypotheses. One that holds that no one foresaw the tremendous potential of computers, an error of underguessing; the other that holds that most market forecasts are far too optimistic, an error of overguessing. It concludes that only before 1950 did experts fail to foresee the ways in which computers would change our lives. After that date, expectations soared, saved only by the fact the sales likewise soared. Keywords. In 1943, just before the creation of ENIAC, electronic numerical integrator and computer, considered by most experts to be the world's first general-purpose digital computer, Thomas Watson Sr., chairman of the IBM Corporation, was quoted as saying, "I think there is a world market for about 5 computers." That single sentence has been recycled so many times by so many writers over the decades that it has come to epitomize what all experts thought would happen to computers. Specifically, it creates the impression that no one foresaw the revolution created by the invention of the computer. A more serious examination of the issue was offered by the Smithsonian's Paul Seruzzi in a book chapter entitled An Unforeseen Revolution, Computers and Expectations 1. In it, he reached a similar conclusion. He notes that computer pioneers had no glimmering of how thoroughly the computer would permeate modern life. Its early inventors, he argues, almost universally concluded that the computer's size and expense limited it to a few installations. He quotes Howard Aiken, for example, an early computer pioneer, as saying that Eckert and Mauchly, the creators of ENIAC, would never sell more than a few of them. As late as 1951, he reports, an internal IBM study concluded that there was a market for no more than 25 machines of its size. Seruzzi surmises that experts misgauged the computer's true market potential because early machines were fragile and unreliable, and their inventors did not see them as anything more than giant scientific calculating machines. In contrast, a study by Schnars and Berenson published the same year as Seruzzi's book chapter examined how expectations lined up with actual outcomes over a wide variety of industries including computers, too. It concluded that most growth market forecasts are overly optimistic. They almost always see more change than actually turns out to be the case. In fact, Only one of the 48 mistaken forecasts examined in the study failed because it was too pessimistic. The implication of that finding is that experts usually see too much of a revolution, not too little. But, to be fair, those authors note that computers are a special case where growth has been so fast and so profound that even the most optimistic predictions of market growth have been largely correct. Whatever the case, in hindsight, it is clear that there was a market for much more than a handful of giant calculating machines. In fact, the invention of the mainframe computer spawned one of the fastest-growing and longest-growing markets in industrial history. From its creation in the midst of World War II to its unequivocal success as an essential business tool some 20 years later, the mainframe computer indisputably revolutionized almost every aspect of modern life. This study looks at the published record of expectations for computers from their inception in the mid-1940s to their establishment as an unequivocal market success in 1964 with the introduction of IBM's massively successful System 360. Basically, data collection entailed locating and reading articles published in reputable sources such as Businessweek, The New York Times, Forbes, and the Wall Street Journal over a 20-year period that discussed the future of computers. These were the types of articles that the typical, educated business person would likely have encountered. They are the kinds of articles that both capture the best ideas of the day and mirrored public opinion on the subject. Incredulous articles published in magazines such as Popular Science or Popular Mechanics were not considered, since it could be argued that their extreme positions would not have been generally accepted at the time they were published. The intent of this study is twofold. First, it is to examine the interplay between expectations and actual outcomes. Were expectations always too pessimistic? Or, did experts' expectations eventually catch up with actual outcomes? Most important, this analysis is done on a year-to-year basis as the market unfolded, not after the fact with the benefit of hindsight. The second part of this study looks at the kinds of tasks experts thought computers would be used for. When, for example, did they switch from a vision of computers as purely scientific machines to something more encompassing? Did the experts correctly anticipate the ways in which computers ended up revolutionizing our everyday lives, or were they perpetually misdirected to uses and applications that never amounted to much? Thomas Edison, for example, reportedly listed listening to music fairly far down on his list of uses to which the phonograph he invented would be put. He thought recording the voices of dying relatives so that offspring could remember what they sounded like was a more likely outcome. To properly frame this study, it is important to note that the very meaning of the term computer has changed substantially from its earliest conceptions. The 1945 ENIAC, for instance, was a huge device, requiring 1,000 feet. It was operated with a plugged board and switches and performed 5,000 operations per second using cards, lights, switches and plugs as input-output. In 1949, the Manchester Mark I seemed petite in comparison, requiring but a room-size space. It functioned as a complete system using some 1,300 vacuum tubes for processing, a cathode ray tube for memory and paper tape, teleprinters and switches for I/O operations. The first commercial computer to be associated with the term was the UNIVAC I, Universal Automatic Computer. Smaller than the ENIAC at 943 cubic feet, it featured serial vacuum tubes, delay lines and magnetic tape technology with magnetic tape, unit typer and printer for input-output devices. It handled 1905 operations per second. In 1956, MIT researchers brought the technology of transistors to computers and thus reconceived the machine again, both technologically and semantically, by building the TX-0, the first general-purpose, programmable computer with transistor technology. In 1959, IBM's 7000 series mainframes became state-of-the-art for speed and reliability, thanks to transistor technology. The IBM 1400 series then improved its transistor processing using smaller, even more reliable transistors and introduced magnetic core memory. In 1964, the IBM System 360 replaced the then outdated transistors integrated circuitry and offered I/O using both punch card equipment and electronic computer systems. The microprocessor, first used in 1974, Selby's 8H line, again changed the computer into a machine resembling only faintly its predecessors in both function and appearance. Once IBM had successfully launched its PC in the early 1980s, computers with processors that could comfortably fit into a suitcase could outperform in scope of capability, speed and user-friendliness the old transistor machines. Plummeting prices for this technology and ever more accessible user interfaces made the PC a typical household and office accoutrement. Their very ubiquity assured that, for the next several decades, the PC was the configuration most commonly associated with the term computer. In the new millennium, computers are commonly understood to refer to a class of devices, including PCs but also smaller, faster and more diverse equipment such as PDAs, personal digital assistants, pocket computers, laptops, game consoles, even mobile phones featuring computer functions. What follows is a history of expectations for the mainframe computer as it happened starting in the mid-1940s. 1. Before 1950, computers as scientific tools. Expectations for computers between 1945 and 1950 started out modest, focusing almost exclusively on science and engineering applications. Sales, meanwhile, were non-existent since the machines were still strictly experimental. The reason for that pessimistic outlook was that the very first computers were cumbersome, experimental machines more akin to nuclear particle accelerators than useful business machines. They were initially designed to calculate Navy gun trajectories and create efficient radar antenna. Funding for these giant electronic brains came mostly from the government with the goal of winning World War II. It is during this earliest period, the period in which Tom Watson uttered that now infamous quote, that the prospects for mainframe computers turned out to be gross underestimates. These were near useless machines and few experts expected them to change much in the years ahead. Within a decade, however, the commercial market for computers had exploded into the business arena, rendering these early expectations gross underguesses. 2 days before Halloween in 1945, for example, MIT revealed to the public the existence of its gigantic mathematical automaton, which had been operational since 6 months after Pearl Harbor, but was kept quiet to fool the Germans. As profiled in both the New York Times and Newsweek, this utterly impractical 2,000-tube, 150-motor, 100-ton, electromechanical computer was seen a harbinger of great things to come. Its designers Samuel Caldwell and Vannevar Bush predicted that future models of this hopeless monstrosity would soon be used in the machines and gadgets everybody will be using in everyday life. 3. What specific projects did they foresee? According to the experts, computers would soon be used to predict earthquakes, forecast the behavior of electrical machinery and aid in the design and performance of airplanes. Almost all of those predictions came true, but expectations for computers before 1950 were almost completely silent and by implication, almost totally blind to the broader role computers found in many others, non-scientific applications. Although the New York Times noted at the time that future versions of the massive machine would help industry, the writer clearly meant that it would be used in design and engineering sorts of tasks, not word processing and payroll preparation. 4. A similar pattern of underguessing was exhibited earlier in 1945, when the New York Times announced the creation of a computer lab at Columbia University. Funded by IBM, the lab's computers would solve problems in the various fields of science that needed lots of mathematical calculations. 5. Again, there was no mention of practical future business uses beyond the science lab. Pessimistic underestimates started to give way to a more optimistic vision as 1950 drew nearer. It became increasingly clear that these wondrous machines would change our lives significantly in the years ahead. But, and this is important to note, that optimism was still myopically restricted to scientific and engineering sorts of tasks, rather than the widespread commercial applications that ultimately prevailed. In early 1947, for example, Newsweek reported enthusiastically on the insights of Vladimir Zaraikin, director of electronic research at Collabs and a television pioneer. He proposed that future computers would not just predict the weather but control it. 6. At the time, he noted, weather data could not be analyzed fast enough to make accurate predictions. All that would change once giant computerized models of the world's weather were created. Under the thesis that enormous effects like hurricanes, droughts and snowstorms start with small triggering forces, he predicted that it might even be possible to send out tankers to spread an oil slick over some square miles of ocean. Then the oil slick will be set on fire so that the heat, rising through the air, will break up the hurricane before it can start its whirling pilgrimage of destruction. Other interventionist measures such as creating fog in the West Indies or snow in Canada might also be made possible by these large mechanical brains. Weather modification was a commonplace prediction of the day. Time magazine talked up the prospects that computers would greatly improve weather forecasting in 1950. So did Coronet magazine, which predicted that weather brains would predict and control the weather. Once a nascent hurricane was spotted, the experts predicted, a computer would dispatch planes to the tropical seas where they would drop chemicals on the water, then set fire to them. The heat from the fire would dissipate the hurricane. None of these radical claims ever came to fruition. A growing sense of environmental concern put an end to such crazy schemes before they started. Still, it was becoming clear that computers would change our lives. They were simply wrong in predicting how that would happen. On a more accurate note, the prestigious science newsletter predicted that if the expectations of experts are fulfilled, giant computers will be found in every college and industrial research laboratory, where they would work on all manner of problems. 7. Again, however, the emphasis was clearly on research, not business use. Military applications would still be important, however, even though the war had ended. Computers are such fast calculators, the experts argued, that once radar locked onto an attacking supersonic rocket they would be used for launching and guiding a countering missile to bring it down before it reached the United States. That claim, which was made in 1950, more than half a century before today's debate over the merits of a Star Wars defense shield. We still debate whether such a system will ever work or is worth the money. It turned out to be an error of optimism. 2. 1950, the press falls in love with computers. The year 1950 is a landmark on the timeline of expectations in that it is the year the press fell in love with computers. From what had been a handful of back-page press reports, the number of stories about the amazing future potential of computers skyrocketed. So did the loftiness of the expectations held out for these magical machines. The two trends fed off each other. Outrageous expectations would be written about, which would draw in more reporters and readers eager to learn more about how computers would change their lives in the future. The result was a veritable flood of increasingly optimistic reports that washed away for good any residual notion that the promise of computers was underestimated. They may have been underestimated before 1950, but optimism ruled the roost from that year forward. By the end of 1950, expectations for computers had expanded way beyond the science and engineering labs, even though the first Univac, the first computer to actually be sold to a customer, was still a year away from being delivered. By then, it was obvious to just about everyone that computers would revolutionize virtually every aspect of life in the future. There was near unanimity that office tasks would be automated and made more efficient by computers. In addition to replacing the typing pool and other clerical functions, Time magazine posed the possibility of electronic stenography. Using this gadget of the future, important executives would speak into a microphone and a computer would translate his words into binary code, and then type out a perfectly typewritten letter. 8. Today, more than 50 years later, we are still working the bugs out of voice recognition software. In another report, Harvard University's Howard Aiken, a computer pioneer who built the Mark IV, an early electromechanical entry, and the man who just a few years earlier had estimated that ENIAC would find few paying customers, changed his tune. He now thought computers would soon be able to forecast economic rain or sunshine with great accuracy. Further out, Professor Aiken believed that it might even be possible to program a machine so that it could beat the stock market. We are still working the bugs out of those programs as well. There was also a debate at the time over whether another new invention, the transistor, would work its way into computers. In 1950, only 2 years after its invention, the Science newsletter predicted, there may be used semiconductors like the transistor, which would replace the electronic tubes, and thus make the computers more reliable and durable. But, not everyone believed the same. At the start of 1954, Life looked at life in the future and concluded that calculating machines like ENIAC would become as important as the printing press, which made available millions of copies of the page on which ideas and mental images are stored. But the newly invented transistor, the magazine predicted, will by no means have displaced all vacuum tubers. 1950, the ultra-sensationalists get airtime. Starting in 1950, amid the frenzy of wildly optimistic expectations for future computers, were two utterly sensationalist and alarmist fears that both frightened and fascinated the public: the idea that automation would cause massive unemployment and the notion that computers would become human-like, with the ability to think creatively and feel human emotions. Both of those fears emerged out of the loud buzz of publicity surrounding computers in 1950. Both were also fostered, although not solely, by the views of MIT professor Norbert Wiener, who had written a book in the late 1940s entitled Cybernetics. He and his book received a great deal of attention during the first few years of the 1950s, and his views framed many of the computer-related discussions during those years. Consider first the seemingly reasonable but, in hindsight, absolutely unfounded argument that automation would cause massive unemployment. Since computers were so incredibly efficient, the argument went, and would be used in virtually every aspect of future life, it seemed to make perfect sense that they would create massive unemployment. Computers would replace workers in one industry after another. Factories would be automated. Office workers would be rendered obsolete as computers took over the tasks they once performed. Besides, historical precedent made the likelihood that that would happen seem greater. The mechanization of farms and factories in the 1930s did cause unemployment. Were computers merely the next step in this long-term trend towards replacing people with machines? Experts fanned the flames of those fears, and an eager press reported it to the public by the bucketful. In 1950, the New York Times reported on a speech by Dr. Wiener in which he warned that computers were bringing about a second industrial revolution. He expressed alarm that large-scale technological unemployment would be the result of computers taking over people's jobs. 10. Time reported on the same speech that automatic factories and mechanical brains to run them may come into use too quickly, and society may not be able to absorb or provide for the human hands and brains that they will replace. 11. A few weeks later, around Christmas 1950, another professor, this one from the University of Delaware, warned that within a decade electronic calculators might take over the tasks now done by millions of white-collar workers. 12. Another expert observed that computers could already perform many of the jobs that once required humans. His prediction: these newfangled computers will replace 78.4% of the men in factories employing more than 100, and 16.5% of the white-collar help. In 10 years, he predicted, 7,500 workers will be replaced by the intelligent machines. Not only were computers going to create massive unemployment, they were going to do it very quickly. What would society do with all those unemployed workers? Would automation create another depression? Remember, the Great Depression had ended only a decade earlier and was still fresh in everyone's mind. The second, and even more unrealistic hypothesis that gained popularity in 1950 was that computers would gradually take on the creative thinking and emotional aspects of the human brain. Professor Wiener was a key proponent of this extremist view as well. While most computer experts agreed that computers would profoundly affect future society, Professor Wiener went a little too far for his colleagues. 8. He believed that computers would gradually take on the feelings and thinking ability of the human brain. Computers might even become disabled by the neurosis and psychosis with which humans are sometimes afflicted. Most scientists scoffed at such notions. They, too, believed that computers would handle all kinds of tasks in the not-too-distant future, but stopped short of believing that computers would someday be able to think like humans. According to Professor Wiener, computers would not only calculate, they would become thinking brains, which would take over an unbelievable variety of thinking tasks. More outlandish, he predicted that by 1965 economic policy would be automated. Giant thinking computers would analyze economic data, and if they predicted another impending depression, the decision to act would not come from the Congress, not from the president, not from the nation's business leaders. It would come from a machine. 13. Professor Wiener single-handedly pushed expectations for computers into the lead in the race against actual outcomes. Such unwise notions were outside the mainstream of the early 1950s, but they point up an important point rather than being unforeseen. Computers were prone to the same overguessing that afflicts most emerging new technologies. Starting in 1950, experts saw computers doing more than they actually ended up doing on both the upside and the downside, not less. 4. 1951, 1956, the feverish 1950s sales and expectations raced skyward. During the first 5 years of the 1950s, expectations clearly soared far ahead of actual outcomes. While 1945, 1950 may have been a period of underguessing, 1958 proved just the opposite. The commercial market for mainframe computers was officially born in 1951 when the first UNIVAC was delivered to the U.S. Census Bureau. Besieged by a bevy of glorious expectations for what computers could do, business users fell in love with the machines just as the press had done a few years earlier. As Business Week noted in 1958, having a computer had taken on an irreligious fervor among businesses. 14. It was the modern things to do. That fervor created a bandwagon effect, where every executive wanted his company computerized, even if the costs made no sense, and the applications to which the computer would be put were unknown. That fervor caused sales of mainframe computers to skyrocket in the mid-1950 seconds, not only catching up with expectations, but also surpassing them. In 1954, IBM introduced the Model 650, the first mass-produced computer designed specifically for business use. Sales soon caught up with expectations as businesses gobbled up IBM 650 seconds as fast as they could be produced. By 1956, both expectations and sales were rushing forward at a stunning pace. Estimates at the time called for 50 companies to have electronic brains installed over the next few years. Instead, a mere 4 years later, the press reported that more than 1,200 companies and government agencies had installed more than 1,700 computers. Even the most optimistic sales forecasts proved too pessimistic in the feverish computer fad of the 1950s. 5. 1957, 1958, sales soared in an era of self-deception. Sales and expectations had soared so high in the 1950s that by 1958 it was clear that irrational exuberance had gotten the upper hand over reasonable business decision-making. Executives, it seemed, were buying computers for glamour rather than business gain, using emotion instead of the more rational ways in which they made other types of business purchases. In fact, few of the executives knew what to do with the computers they had installed in their companies. A 1958 survey revealed that 40% of early adopters were disappointed with the results. Business Week concluded, probably in no area of management has there been so much self-deception as in the early computer surge. The Wall Street Journal reported similar findings. It concluded that applications had not lived up to general expectations. As a result, the selling of computers needs to swing back a little bit to the practical and realistic approach. 15. The first problem was costs, which turned out to be much higher than projected. Instead of the projected $300,000 a year, actual expenses were typically 2 or even 3 times higher. Furthermore, labor savings due to automation proved lower than expected. Fully 75% of the workers were still needed after the computer did its duty. In some cases, the personnel savings were zero. Jobs were not eliminated. They merely changed. But the bad press did nothing to quell either the soaring expectations for computers or their sales. As the Wall Street Journal noted in 1958, users won't return to old methods and orders are not being cancelled. Soaring sales caused sales forecasts for mainframe computers to point even more steeply skyward. The two seemed perfectly in tune. In 1958, Forbes reported that conservative projections put the size of the computer market at $1 billion by 1965, 4 times higher 1957 levels, and $1.5 billion by 1970, 13 years into the future. 16. Generally, such heady forecasts prove overwrought. But, with computers the opposite occurred. A Wall Street Journal report tabbed the actual size of the market at $1.3 billion in 1963, 30% higher and 2 years earlier than the earlier Forbes forecast, 17. 6. 1958, 1960, picking the competitive winner. By the late 1950s, virtually everyone agreed that computers were going to be a big and fast-growing business. As a result, firms rushed in to get a piece of the market. But Forbes was worried. If computers did not make much economic sense for the companies that adopted them, they made even less sense for the companies trying to sell them. The problem was that no one had even come close to turning a profit in the computer business. So far it was all faith and no cash. The fervor that had infected buyers infected sellers even more. According to Forbes, most firms were so enamored of the glamour of this high-tech business that they were running their balance sheets ragged just for the sake of prestige. Many firms flooded into the computer business for defensive reasons. Computers, it seemed certain, would render everything from typewriters to mimeograph machines obsolete. Firms had to make sure that they would not be left without saleable products as the newer equipment came along and made their mechanical systems obsolete. Although dozens of firms entered, Wall Street had already picked the winner. Ming and Rand's Univac may have pioneered the market, but by 1958 IBM had installed the base of 125 large computers to Univac's 50. There seemed little doubt that the punch card giant would win the competitive battle, even though the battle had just started. Investors drew the same conclusions. They were willing to pay $49.50 for every $1 of IBM earnings, but only $10.75 for every dollar of Ming and Rand's earnings. The only question bantered about in the business press during these years was who would be the number 2 and 3 players. Would it be National Cash Register, Royal Typewriter, Underwood Typewriter, or Adressograph Multigraph, the mimeograph seller? The glamour, the fervor, and the incredible potential of computers reached a crescendo by the end of the decade. Computers, it seemed, could and would do everything anyone could imagine. Business Week seemed effused with unreal optimism in 1959 when it proclaimed, "There seems to be no limit to the possibilities that scientists see for computers." 18. Just what were some of those possibilities? A West Coast conference of prominent computer scientists suggested 3 significant applications, none of which turned out to be true. First, according to one MIT scientist, computers would move from mere number crunchers into the domain of human decision-making. They would actually make high-level policy decisions. That is not to say that they provide information to managerial decision-makers, or computers themselves would make the decisions. In Washington, for example, computers would assume decision-making duties of the President of the U.S. if he was not immediately available when an aggressor nation threatened an attack. Valuable minutes would be saved by this new approach. Second, another scientist, this one from the Navy, predicted that computers would soon serve as automated translators. Commanders would speak into computer-equipped radios, into which military orders could be spoken in English and heard thousands of miles away by our allies. The third use of computers in the future would be to speed up decision-making by the Federal Reserve. Instead of adjusting the discount rate the old-fashioned way every few months, this body could eliminate the usual time lag in decisions to lower the discount rate by providing a continuous flow of field data straight from the economy to the decision-makers. 7. 1960, 1963, expectations of profound change. The dawn of the 1960s brought with it an expectation that the revolution in computers would be so profound that we humans had better plan for some of the unintended consequences of that revolution. In 1961, for example, the Wall Street Journal warned that the widespread automation of businesses would result in a loss of the nuances of judgment that made many systems work. As one lawyer noted, computer errors are going to cause a great many headaches to a great many banks. 19. Routine errors in check processing, for example, which humans could fix but computers could not, would wreak havoc on many business deals, creating work for the lawyers, who would be called to straighten out the many messes. Completely automated industrial processes would create even more onerous problems. A computer-driven chemical plant might mistakenly order a mixture that killed workers and nearby residents. None of these things had happened, the journal noted, but they were something to worry, or at least write, about. The New York Times made an equally compelling argument in January 1962 when it argued that the computer revolution would be so profound that it would negatively affect the human psyche. Computers were taking over so many tasks once performed by humans that man's ego might suffer from the slow blurring of the distinction between human and machine thinking. 20. Overall, in the early 1960s it was widely expected that computers would affect future citizens in revolutionary ways: a million-fold increase in the speed of calculations, a 1,000-fold decrease in cost, all this while scientists were just beginning to explore these possibilities. The spirit of these expectations shows the sheer exuberance of experts, reporters and the general public. The press mostly crowed about the upside potential for computers. In 1962 the legendary John Mauchly took a look at the future of computing almost 20 years after he first co-invented ENIAC, the first real computer. 21. His visions were a mixture of absolute prescience and sheer overguessing. They were anything but underguesses. First, he argued that the present emphasis on miniaturizing components of missiles and spacecraft will inevitably result in developing small, inexpensive computers within the reach of almost everyone. Furthermore, and equally on target, he noted, there is no reason to suppose the average boy or girl cannot be master of a personal computer. That is exactly what happened. John Mauchly was not just theorizing. He had already produced a 50-pound portable computer and predicted that within a decade, by 1972, everyone would have his own computer. It would be pocket-sized, like today's personal digital assistants. What would it be used for? According to Mauchly, the housewife of the future would order groceries using her handheld personal computer, then go to the store where the food along with other popular items such as use once and throw away clothes would rush down a chute for her to take home. This pocket-sized computer would even authorize a deduction from her computerized checking account. All this revolutionary change brought about fears as well as opportunities. In a refrain nearly identical to that still proffered today, it was widely argued in the early 1960s that since computers would be able to track all sorts of personal information, it was important to ensure that this information will not be used against a person. The fear was that the data could be pooled, drawn on and used in ways for which they were not intended. We are still warned to be fearful of the same thing. One prominent admirer with the magical name Watson, Arthur Watson, warned that we were entering a new computer age, where we would have to defend against the tyranny of computers. 22. In the future, computers would have such a profound influence on the running of businesses that there are bound to be some businesses that destroy themselves through excessive control. Governments would face especially vexing problems, because computers were like a kind of automated nosy neighbor. The essence of these arguments makes clear how much revolutionary change expected from the widespread diffusion of computers in business and government. 8. 1964, the introduction of IBM's Model 360. This article ends at the beginning, with the introduction of IBM's stunningly successful System 360, the first family of compatible machines. Actually, it was not introduced in 1964, it was merely announced on the 7th of April. Delivery would not be made until 1965 and 1966. Sales climbed to 1,000 units a month by 1966, making the System 360 the most successful computer ever sold up until that time. It also marked the point at which computers became commonplace business tools. Throughout the 1960s, and on into the 1970s, 1980s and 1990s, expectations continued to soar skyward, followed by equally outlandish actual sales growth. But none of this is new. As a Wall Street Journal report noted in 1964 when it looked at what the future holds for these electronic wizards, it concluded that computer experts say we haven't seen anything yet. Computers would soon be capable of understanding the spoken word and to translate one language to another in real time, making international phone calls a snap. Amazing developments were just over the horizon. Computers might even be able to signal a computer at a bank to debit a customer's account by the amount of a purchase and credit the store's account. 9. Summary and conclusions. 8 important conclusions emerge from this historical study. 9.1. Early inventors did not see the potential of computers. Cernuschi was right. From the brief period ranging roughly from the late 1930s until just before 1950, researchers of the world's first early computers and the machines that preceded them were generally too pessimistic in their outlook. They tended to underguess the size of the market. 9.2. After 1950 the computer revolution was foreseen. The primary finding of this study is that contrary to conventional wisdom the computer revolution was neither unforeseen nor unexpected. With the exception of that brief period before 1950, computers have always been viewed as magical machines that would change the world in significant ways. In fact, after 1950, even before the first commercial computer was installed, expectations for computers were almost universally imbued with a sense of gross optimism that in most other industries would have led to severe errors of optimism. Fig 1 presents this finding graphically. Download full-size image. Fig 1. Market evolution of computers, predicted versus actual. 9.3. Market fever creates bandwagon effects. The computer revolution, and part of the reason such optimistic expectations for it came to fruition, was that the early industry was struck with the fever that created an unrealistic need for the new machines. Just as VCRs, DVDs, fax machines, and a host of other consumer goods inexplicably found their way into the spotlight of public consciousness, so too did computers benefit from the extraordinary amount of attention they received. Once the press started to extol the product's benefits, companies clamored to have a computer, even if they did not need one. That fever created bandwagon effects that helped propel the industry skyward. 9.4. Experts tended to overguess the applications to which computers would be put. While experts did well at predicting the general trend that computers would greatly influence our lives, they did less well in predicting the specific applications to which computers would be put. Mostly they guessed too much change. Although there was near universal agreement that repetitive office tasks like payroll preparation would be computerized, other applications such as weather modification, real-time translators, economic forecasting machines, and computers imbued with the reasoning ability of humans proved non-starters. Computers changed our lives, and they certainly turned out to be more than strictly scientific machines as was first predicted, but many of the fantastic uses to which they were expected to be put never materialized. 9.5. Social consequences were mostly gross overguesses. Experts did worst when they tried to discern how computers would affect our lives in the future. The automation fear was utterly plausible but proved unfounded. Computers neither replaced nor dehumanized the citizens of advanced societies that embraced these machines. They ended up doing few of the things social forecasters thought they would. 9.6. Picking the competitive winner. One of the most unique findings regarding expectations for computers was that it was clear to almost everyone that IBM would end up the winner. The firm was neither the innovator, nor the first entrant, but no sooner had it stated its intention to enter the business than Wall Street deemed it the competitive winner. Old man Watson may have been a bad forecaster. There was certainly a market for more than 5 computers, but once his son, Thomas Watson Jr. took over the firm, he targeted and won the battle for market dominance. 9.7. Outsized expectations meets incredible market growth. What makes the case of computers so noteworthy is not that they were unforeseen. Almost all of those who looked saw great growth from the humble beginnings. It is that those rosy expectations, sometimes outrageously optimistic expectations, were met by an equally incredible rate of actual sales growth. In other words, starting in 1950, expectations for computers were in a feverish race with actual sales to see which could be more outlandish. But, in this unique case, outlandishness paid off in terms of very accurate forecasts. In many other product categories, expectations saw far ahead of actual sales and reality. But, with computers the race was more even. Sometimes sales overtook expectations. Other times expectations surged into the lead. But, over the decades, the two contestants seemed far more evenly matched than is the case with many other innovations. That neck-and-neck long-distance race is what makes computers truly unique. To illustrate the extent to which expectations for computers were overblown, consider the two technologies that dominated visions of the future in the 1950s: computers and nuclear energy. Although the two technologies seem so unlike today with the benefit of hindsight, at the time they were expected to soar in tandem. And many of the experts that looked at the future of technology during those years paired the two like twins. Ralph Cordiner, for example, chairman of General Electric, noted at the time, "When the history of our age is written, I think it will record three profoundly important technological developments: nuclear energy, automation and computers." 14. So did David Sarnoff, COS chairman, who in 1955 predicted that computers and nuclear energy together are certain to dwarf the industrial revolutions brought about by steam and electricity. 23. Computers, he believed, would usher in a revolutionary era of automation. Unfortunately, he also predicted there would be nuclear-powered automobiles, planes, rockets and ships. But, in the case of nuclear energy, those exuberant forecasts proved far too optimistic. Nuclear energy foundered while computers soared. 9.8. Quote the son, not the father. In closing, the Thomas Watson Sr. quote with which this paper started has served to provide a misleading vision of how experts viewed the future of computers. His son Thomas Watson Jr. did much better, albeit 20 years later, when he said, "There doesn't seem to be any real limit to the growth of the computer industry." 24. In the more than 30 years that have passed since he made that prescient statement, the computer industry has soared.